This is my current workbench, which is also my router table, my outfeed table, my assembly table, and my miter saw stand. It's a jack of all trades, which also means it's a master of none. It's missing some important features, like a large work surface, clamping ability, actual storage, and something outside of its control, a level garage floor. This is my new workbench, which will address those needs and more, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I do have a few obstacles when it comes to building this new workbench. The size of my shop, constantly overestimating my skill level, and I want the cost of this workbench to be reasonable and cost effective. So that means no hardwoods, no plywoods, and no 2x4s either. So that leads us to the elephant in the room. I'm just going to rip the band-aid off now. This workbench is going to be made out of OSB. Hold up, wait a minute, don't click off this video. This is not a required feature. This workbench is a bit of a proof of concept idea. So consider the OSB, the rough draft material, in this beta test. I originally was going to make this out of plywood, but there's a problem. I'm old yet young enough to remember the days when pine plywood at Home Depot, cabinet grade plywood panels were around $35 a sheet. But today, it's $56. And regular plywood is now, that can't be right. $83. That's crazy. But then I remember that ancient proverb. If you can make it out of plywood, you can make it out of OSB.
If you can dodge a wrench, you can dodge a ball.
Same principle. The OSB equivalent is $30. And just like Baltic birch, OSB has no voids in it. I mean, technically, it is true, from a certain point of view. I got the idea to make this workbench base from Hooked on Wood. Side note, he sells plans for it if you're interested. Link in the description. I chose this base as it has the strength I need for my work, which is mainly dealing with slabs, sheet goods, hardwood boards, a door, and occasionally some pallet wood. Semi-pro tip, label your pieces while you're cutting them out. I had about 56 pieces I needed to cut out, and it can get pretty easy to lose track of them. When trying to be cheap, mistakes can be costly, so cut twice, measure once, as they say. Now that I have everything cut and ripped down, this is when my plan started to fall apart. Let me explain. My plan is to do the glue up in two phases. First, the intersections of the legs, and then the outer boards. However, I don't laminate very often, so I didn't think through this whole glue up process enough, and I quickly started to realize I have some problems. I don't own enough clamps. So I decided to use brad nails to clamp these boards together while the glue dried. But then I started to think, is shooting a bunch of nails into this wood the best idea? Especially since I haven't thought through how I'm actually going to connect all the different pieces to make the base. So the answer to myself was no. Having a plan is one thing, but having a good plan is a whole lot better. I'm just going to take my time and be patient with the clamps that I have. I considered using screws, but I didn't want to make unnecessary holes in the base. This was most likely a foolish decision on my part, as this is the intersections and won't be visible. But at the moment, it made perfect sense to me. Not so much now. Now that I've glued up all the intersections and they've had time to dry, I went ahead and cut them to length, which made me realize problem 2 of my plan. At this point, I left all the boards oversized. The plan was to rip them down to their final width once all the pieces have been glued together. It's always important to know your own skill level and work within your ability. For me, there was no way that I was going to be able to perfectly glue these boards up parallel and also achieve a 90-degree open mortise joint. Whenever it's necessary, I make sure to take the time to make a jig. It's literally number 4 on my shop rules. This simple jig made from offcuts will make up for my lack of glue up skills. I went ahead and ripped all the pieces down to their final dimension. Then I used the jig to align the boards, added a few brad nails to hold everything into position, then I could clamp everything together and wait for the glue to dry. When making this type of base, there's one more thing you need to think about. The main stretchers and leg posts are going to be attached with an open slot mortise and tenon. Now I'm guessing, but when you're using a higher grade sheet good, the quality control is going to be much higher. So regardless if you're using cheap plywood or OSB, you might want to keep in mind that you should pull the sheet goods from the same bundle to try to eliminate the next problem. The OSB that I'm using, I didn't get on the same day from the same bundle, as I was using sheets that I had left over and some I just bought. and there's a 1/16 of an inch difference in thickness. Hindsight is a powerful drug, and if I was doing this again, I would make sure all the thicknesses were roughly the same size. So I went ahead and just used the blunt force method. And it worked. Did I get a little bit of separation? Well, yes, and I will deal with that later. I made sure to leave the stretcher pieces long so I could go ahead and use a pole saw and cut everything flush to show that I'm a real woodworker and not some crazy OSB loving beta male. Are you confused by that statement? Me too. You got the touch. You got the power. To connect the base, I'm going to use pocket holes. I'm not a big fan of pocket holes, and it's probably not for the reason you're thinking. Semi-pro tip, don't set your pocket holes too deep and make sure not to overdrive the screw, as this will cause the wood to split. I've done this with plywood before, so it's not unique to OSB. And I know some people are thinking, well, duh, but there's at least one person out there that needed to hear this. If you're wondering, is this base going to be strong enough? After all, it's made out of OSB. Well, I'll go ahead and walk on it. I'm not sure how much I weigh right now, less than 300, probably more than 270, so strong enough. I went ahead and painted the base, as this was a good way for me to get rid of some extra paint that I had laying around. And my thinking here is that this should help with any moisture absorption problems in the future. Maybe, but I don't know for sure, as I'm still getting used to Texas and its humidity. I designed my workbench top after Ron Paulk's Smart Bench. He sells plans for it if you're interested. Link in the description. I went ahead and chose this style because I like its versatility. Bonus, it's pretty simple to build, but that won't stop me from being extra, as you'll see. I used my CNC to create some templates for this workbench top, but this could also be done using a table saw, a miter saw, a hole saw bit, and a jigsaw. I used the templates in combination with the table saw, some screws, a spade drill bit, and a flush trim router bit to make sure that everything was the exact same dimensions for all the workbench top pieces. This way, I removed the human error, which is me. That didn't sound right, but I think you know what I mean. I did try to use my jigsaw table to first cut out the cutout, but that took way too much time. The faster route was just using the spade bit and the router table to cut out the opening. Since this is OSB, it cut pretty easily. But faster isn't always cleaner, and it left me with a lot of dust to clean up. Even with that extra cleanup time, it was worth it, as I hate any task that requires me to use a jigsaw. I added a well-deserved roundover to the cutouts to avoid any unnecessary splinters. Then I could go ahead and paint all the parts. I'm going to give you a free tip that doesn't just apply to OSB. Anytime you're using a butt joint, pre-drill and try to avoid screwing too close to the edge. That way you can avoid splitting the wood. Disappointed! What? It was a free tip. I didn't say it was going to be mind-blowing. I made sure to add glue to the joints, but I also painted all the faces of the boards, so I don't know how much holding power this will really give. But I more than made up for it with all the screws that I added to this workbench. For the top and bottom of the workbench, I left everything oversized. That way I could come back with my track saw and a router bit to flush everything up. If you wanted, you could cut the top and bottom to size, but again, I'm removing my probable error from the equation. If anyone has any good router dust collection tips, let us know in the comments, as I'm clearly in need of it. But don't you worry, I did come back and paint those exposed OSB edges. I know, big sigh of relief. At this point, you could attach the worktop to the base, add some scrap wood footies to raise it off the floor, cover the lower shelf, and you would have a pretty solid workbench for about $137. Here's a quick breakdown, in case you're wondering. But a workbench wouldn't be complete without some accessories. So let's do that. A replaceable work surface is a nice to have. Since this workbench is also going to be acting as the outfeed table, it needs to have a smooth surface. So we need to cover the OSB. If you're looking to save some money, you could get a sheet of hardboard for about $15, and that would work great. But for me, I'm going to go with MDF, 3/4 inch MDF. This brings me back to the CNC. Not because I'm too lazy to cut out a square, but because I'm too lazy to cut out a bunch of circles. This could be done with any type of 3/4 inch bit or a 20mm bit, completely up to you. But the CNC will help me not to make any errors.
CNCs are not foolproof.
So, I seem to be a master of disaster, which means I also need to be a problem solver. Let me explain.
I see you.
Once the holes were cut out, I got an error message, and the CNC stopped working. So I went ahead and recreated the cut file, but this time without the holes. So now we should be good to go. But then I went ahead and hit one of the screws that was holding down the MDF. Not once, not twice, but all 4 times it passed that area, which caused the CNC to get out of position, or I messed something up in the cut file. Either way I look at it, it was me doing something wrong. The second half of the MDF top cut out fine, but the 2 tops are clearly different shapes. Since I was creating 2 MDF tops to begin with, I should have just ran the cut file for the second top and used that as a template to cut out the first one, as they are mirror images to each other. In the end, I had to do that and more to fix the issues anyways, so the saying's true, shortcuts are always short-sighted. To add insult to injury, I dropped one of the tops. And when I did that, my instincts kicked in and I reached for the MDF, which was not a great idea. Thankfully though, I didn't injure myself, and the only thing to be damaged was the corners of the top. Now that this is fixed, we can go ahead and talk about how we're actually going to attach it down. Threaded inserts is the answer to that rhetorical question. You could go ahead and screw down the top, but I'm using this bench as a little bit of a proof of concept, as one day plywood will go down in cost, or I might just win the lottery. So I'm planning right now for version 2. I had the CNC pre-drill all the holes where the threaded inserts were going to be located. Good idea in theory, but the execution was poor on my part. Trying to countersink the holes afterwards didn't really work. In the end, it was just easier for me to countersink new holes myself and drill them all out. If I was a smarter man, I would have used the CNC to also countersink those holes. You don't know what you don't know, which is very true. So I'm not done making mistakes. I thought you couldn't mess up threaded inserts, but here I am. This is the first insert hole that I drilled, and I learned some important lessons from it. This should come to no surprise, but don't set your inserts too close to the edge of your OSB or your plywood. It's not the best idea. This corner of the bench now looks like the first pancake you make, which also never comes out right. I'll just go ahead and count all the mistakes that I've made with this bench as knowledge gained for version 2. Fixing the top meant removing material, so I'm just going to go ahead and use some scrapped MDF to fill in that gap. And I'm just going to screw this little piece down, as when I replace this top in the future, this shouldn't be needed. Well, hopefully. It can be very easy to overcomplicate a build. So I'm going to go ahead and take the easy way out when it comes to future glue ups. I'm just going to use plastic, like painter's tape, or this floor protector roll, or you could even use some cardboard like this. But if you really want to, you could laminate the top. Completely up to you. Part of the reason why I chose to build this type of workbench base is because my garage floor is unleveled and has random low spots, as you can tell. The leveling feet came with these screws, which is nice, but since this is OSB, I'm going to use some 2-inch long screws. I don't trust that these small screws won't just rip out one day. Also, if you recall, I used the blunt force method when assembling this base, which caused a bit of separation. So this ended up being a win-win, double-win situation. That's better now. The perfect small shop workbench would be pretty useless if you couldn't easily move it around, but I don't always seem to mind my surroundings. So using casters that can be removed will help avoid the inevitable, which is a smart move on my part. Using some offcuts and some super glue, I made a quick jig to help me with the placement of the wheel brackets. Life is a little better when you treat your future self right. I attached the wheel brackets with 2.5-inch long screws because, again, this is OSB. This is a rare case of me working smarter and not harder. Normally, it's the other way around. From the leftover OSB, I'm going to make a little cabinet to store all of my workbench related items. I'm really nailing my new shop rule about making jigs. Jigs don't always have to be pretty. This jig here would be even better if I had some toggle clamps. But I'm working in the moment, and in this moment, this is all I had. I'm not going to use any fancy joinery, not because this is OSB, but because this is shop furniture. And I've been making shop related items for about 4 months now, and I'm really ready to move on. I went ahead and used some scrap OSB to act as drawer slides, or at least what I'm calling drawer slides, and attached them with some glue and nails. It's definitely not anything fancy, but it gets the job done for shop furniture. For the drawers, I'm going to keep everything really simple. Some glue, a nail to hold everything together, a little bit of pre-drilling, add a few screws, and you got a drawer box. For the bottoms, I just went ahead and used some leftover 1/4 inch MDF, some glue and nails. And to add a little class, I went ahead and gave the drawers a little bit of a round over. I went ahead and gave the cabinet a coat of paint, and then I could go ahead and install it with a few screws to hold everything in place. When needed, I can easily expand and add more drawers, but for now, this will do. But I did add a little bit of fun to the drawers. We have the Duck of Oregon, the Duck of Gizmo, the Duck of the Night, and last and least of all, the Duck of Edgelordom. Okay, you know how I said I was too lazy to drill circles? Well, I'm going to have to do that. This is an unfortunate yet necessary step to be able to clamp down items to the work surface. Even more unfortunate, I had to use my router and a flush trim bit to clean up all the holes. I put this whole process on hold for as long as I could, as I knew this was going to create a nasty little mess. For clamping with this workbench, I went ahead and just bought these clamps for now, which work also great with a track saw, as I'm in this mode of not buying tools until I need them. Being broke also helps with that.
Can't make the scene if you don't have the green.
One thing that I didn't account for is adding that additional thickness with the removable top would make it so that these clamps couldn't just slide into place. So I have to remove this screw and then come up from the bottom of the work surface to be able to clamp anything down. Not the worst thing, but also slightly annoying. Another nice thing about this bench top is that you can clamp wood to the bench itself, which acts as a pseudo vise, which for me is good enough, at least for now. This last accessory has a lot of great potential, but it's also one of those ideas that could either be great or a complete bust. I'm not crazy enough to think that somebody hasn't thought about this already, but as it's said in Ecclesiastics, what has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done, and there's nothing new under the sun. So I'm pretty sure somebody else has thought of this, but I couldn't find it on the internet. So maybe it's mine, or maybe it's Maybelline. I don't know. I created a few versions of the wings, that way I could test them out over time to see which one works best. One version of the wings just slide into place, while the other version uses a simple slot joint to secure the wings to the workbench. I went ahead and created a jig to help me drill out matching holes in each of the wings. Looks pretty in the middle. The holes I drilled out will be filled with some glue and a threaded insert to connect the wings and the extension tops. Speaking of tops, I actually made 2 versions of that as well. A small version for those times that I just need a little bit of extra work surface, and a medium version for those times where I need a medium version. I had plans to make a full length extension, but I'll have to save that for version 2. But this whole process wasn't just gumdrop rainbows and unicorns. In retrospect, I should have made the workbench top out of 2 layers of MDF, as the OSB doesn't actually have even thickness across all the board, or the sheet, whichever one you want to call it. I didn't realize this when I was designing this part of the workbench, so I just used some playing cards and washers to get everything leveled with each other. Depending on your need, this could be completely a non-issue, but for me, I want the extension wings to be leveled with the workbench. I really like this idea, and I'm already trying to figure out ways to improve it. As you could probably tell, it's a little cumbersome putting this thing together, and I want to make it a smoother process in the future. So apparently, I didn't account for where the location of the front wings were going to be when designing this. I'll need to address this in version 2. as I need to add some additional screw holes here and here, as I don't trust the current location will provide enough support strength. With the wings attached, the workbench surface can go from a length of 62 inches to 79 inches, or from a work surface of 31 inches to 48 inches. I made sure to label where all the wings go for my future self. As I said before, this OSB thickness varies in thickness. If you're wondering why threaded inserts, well, I really like the idea to be able to flat pack things when I'm not using them. Glue and screws would also work, but then you're going to need the room to be able to store them fully assembled, which I don't have. In total, this workbench cost me $220. Which doesn't include the cost of the wings, which I mainly made with leftover materials, and the pair of clamps that I bought. I'm Joseph with 5 Duck Studio. Hope to see you next time. Wouldn't be the same without you. Or, you're not supposed to throw that one. Or, you could even use some cardboard, like this.